Thank you all, and especially thank you for the lovely introduction. I cannot get up here and begin to talk to any of you guys without giving special thanks to Glenda Maynard for putting this all together and inviting me back here to NSU to speak with you all tonight. It's such a pleasure, such an honor. I want to say that I'm a bit nervous because this is such a legendary place to be, such an amazing, amazing place with amazing students and staff that's incredibly dedicated to them. And so it's just such an honor. All that out the way, I am very informal. So there is no doctor in front of my name. There are no other titles associated with me at all. I'm y'all cousin Alex for the next 45 minutes. I mean, even later, I'm sure that there's somebody in here that I'm kin to. So that said, I hope that we can have a very informative conversation this evening and also relax a little bit, for me, for my sake and my nerves. I will just give you guys a little bit more information about essentially why we're here with the project Soul Down River. Soul Down River is an incredible project housed here at Norfolk State University, led by our Dr. Stephanie Richmond, that essentially is aimed at tracing over 20,000 individuals who were sold right here from the port of Norfolk, Virginia, and shipped to the Deep South, primarily New Orleans, Louisiana. And so this project is very special because it's one of the only projects that has acknowledged the city of Norfolk's role in the domestic slave trade, but also it's one of the only projects that acknowledges the individual humanity of all of those people. There's not 20,000 people in this room, but already looking at you all, I can't imagine what it would be to know each of your names right now and know all of your stories. And so to just sit with that, this project is really special to me. It's a bit of a spiritual work as well to be able to combine my experience and knowledge. And so because it's a spiritual work, I'm just going to go ahead and pour a little libation for all of those that we will focus on today and all of those that we still have yet to name and learn about, just to welcome their memory into this room, and for all of those that we have lost recently. Ashe. I'm going to go ahead and get started with just a little background about genealogy. So again, I'm very informal, okay? But I'm still a bit thorough when it comes to this. So I'm going to give you guys a few little core foundation things. So we're going to go through how we're not going to approach genealogy, okay? How many folks in here have heard about Ancestry.com? How many folks in here know the names of their grandparents? All right. How many folks in here find that to be really exciting? Okay. You see there's a difference, right? How many folks in here can't stand it or are incredibly bored by it? Okay, that's actually surprising. That's good. That's actually really good. So I want to just kind of talk about some of the challenges with genealogy, specifically as it relates to our people. And then we'll talk about how projects like Soul Down River are changing the narrative. There's a couple little technical terms that I'm going to use. And so here's a little lingo for us. So genealogy is a line of descent traced continuously from an ancestor. That is Webster's definition. My definition is that it's just tracing the lines of connection between one person, community, family, and event. So even if you do not come from the same lineal family, the same blood family, genealogies are as recent as us sitting in this room. That's a genealogy as well. Ancestry is more so defined as a lineal descent directly from one person to their immediate ancestors. Community is a group of people living in the same space or having a particular characteristic in common, a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. And then let's jump down to kinfolks, and kindred. A very simple definition is just one's family and relations. But realistically, it is anyone who shares a common ancestry, a relationship, experience, community, belief, and also a common perspective. I emphasize that because traditional genealogy, especially from a Eurocentric standpoint, really wants you to identify them versus us. They want to identify how close you are, how far you are from blackness, how far you are from poverty, how far you are from oppression, to make sure that you don't look like the margins. Kin can't fit in that picture, right? And so since I've been doing genealogy, I've evolved to understand that kinship is very broad and is actually what links us all. A little more lingo. Home is just a place where one lives. It's a place tied to memories of all sorts, and anywhere where one feels community. How many church folks do we have in here? All right. So you guys know the definition of this next one, church home. I'm a Bay Area native. When I moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, almost just over a year ago, one of the first questions that I was asked was, where's your church home? And I felt at home because that's the same thing that we're asking in Oakland, California as well. And so it's generally one church located near a residence where someone was raised, baptized, or a family attended. My church home is called Second Mount Zion Baptist Church. I have not been there in probably 15 years, but that's where I know I can walk through and know everybody's face in there, and they know exactly where I'm at this moment. Tomorrow they will be watching this video at the church. So all that out the way, again, my name is Alex Trapps-Chabala. I am a Bay Area native, as I said, by way of the Gulf Coast. My family has been in the Bay Area since the 1940s, give or take. My mother was born in a little place called Owasso, Alabama. My dad was born in Oakland, California. I am the youngest of 13. And I grew up with this very deep connection with home. No one identified California as home. They always identified Alabama, Louisiana as home. And so I grew up every year going back down to Alabama and Louisiana, to the very place that my mother that lived in the house that my mother was born in, that her mother was born in, and her mother before her. And so I grew up being able to hear everybody's business is one part of it. So I'm the youngest of 13. My mom, my dad, and all four of my grandparents are the oldest children of oldest children. And then on some sides, oldest children going back further. And from a really large, tight-knit family that gossips a lot and also shows up to everything. And so because I was that youngest child, also known as the uh-oh baby, I got taken to every funeral that happened across the country, and every wedding, every birthday, every divorce trial, whatever, you name it, I was there with my grandparents. And so because of that, I got in everybody's business, even though that goes against the core Black family tradition is to stay in a child's place. And so when I was getting in everyone's business, there was a point where I was like, I still don't know how cousin so-and-so is my cousin. I still don't know why I'm calling this person auntie, but she doesn't look like us. She is not my mother's sister. She's not my grandparent's sister. But somehow there was a story back there. And so I'll jump forward a little bit, but I got started with genealogy, I want to say the first time that I asked how so-and-so was related or where so-and-so was from. So I'll say that I started genealogy as a 12-year-old, but I was definitely much younger. But when I got started, we were definitely not in the conversation about a family history. I grew up watching Disney Channel and everything else, and you would see, a white kid go online and click and clack, and then they pull up their whole family history going back to the beginning of time. And like any good millennial, I thought that I could do that too. But what I was met with was something a little different at the time, so this is pre-Obama. When I got started doing genealogy, it's a quick story, I was still getting in people's business, but I was about 12, and in our family we have a family tradition of being sent to Alabama from California, where they can reform you a little bit, because I had a smart mouth. And so my parents put me on a Greyhound bus and sent me packing to Alabama, to my great-grandmother's house, prepared never to see me again because they didn't think I would survive it. But as Dr. Richmond shared, I moved down there 2 years, And one summer, my great-great-great aunt, Cora, died. She was the last of 26 children born to a formerly enslaved couple, okay? And so I attended that funeral thinking, oh, they're dragging me to another funeral. But then what I was met with was tons and tons and tons of speakers that got up there and didn't tell just stories about our Aunt Cora, but about our entire family's history, going back several generations. And so because of that, I was on the edge of my seat. My great-grandmother looks over, who was not a devout Christian woman, says, excuse my French, I got something for your little, you know how that goes. So afterwards, her and my grandmother, who had driven down from California, took me to the family's graveyard and pointed to every grave, every name, the unmarked ones and the big, monuments, and told me every little bit about who was there and that was mine. And so that just changed my life. It entirely opened my eyes, but I started asking more questions. And there was a point where they could not answer those questions any longer. And so, like any good millennial, I went and got back on the internet where it was available in rural Alabama. This is before Wi-Fi. And this was what I was met with, was the website that you're seeing here. So this was, at the time, the only free website that was apparently dedicated to genealogy. If you guys are familiar with Family Search, because we are on camera, there's not much that I will say, but Family Search is ran by the Latter-day Saints. And it was a website that was created essentially to help members of the Latter-day Saint community find out about their family members, which is part of their process for being part of the Latter-day Saints. And so they created this website that essentially had, at the time, the Social Security Death Index, which any American citizen would have when they die. They had a pedigree resource file, which I don't think anyone in here would know what that means just by reading that. But basically, it was just strung together family trees that people put together to say that they were related to Cleopatra. And then it had the 1880 census, and it was just an indexed version of it, and that was about it. And so imagine me going on here, I type in a couple names, and nothing comes back. Even though I had been hearing and living on land that my ancestors lived on, that I knew their names, I knew their birth dates, I knew who their parents were even, and I could find nothing on this website. By no means am I the first Black person to research their family history. The lineage of Black family history goes back very far, but it was popularized with roots. So how many folks know the name Kunta Kinte? How many folks know the name Alex Haley? Right? Nothing that we're talking about today would be possible without that work. However, because of the interest that was sparked by that, Black folks had begun to form, small communities researching their family histories. But at the same time, we were still left completely out of a narrative that was still ours. And so over time, Family Search continues to expand, and then a couple other helpful websites. By the time that I was about 13 or so, I started posting in forums just asking if people knew my family or anything about my family, and it takes off. A few years later, I started researching all over the country. Okay, presentation over. But the reality is that it was a long, long journey to connect with other Black researchers around the country and to basically develop databases and advocate for records relating to our ancestors to actually be available, even on sites like Ancestry and other platforms. Over time, the genealogy world has completely changed, has become more digital focused. But at the time that I started, you had to travel across country, sometimes to the counties that your families were from. And I could not do that as a 12-year-old, let alone a poor 12-year-old in California. And so I was still left out of being able to really find my ancestry until I went into a family search center and they said, what can we help you with? And so I'm thinking that they're going to roll out my full family history. I'm still holding on to that Disney Channel dream. And instead they said, well, there's nothing on your ancestors here. And they said, okay, well, maybe we should Google. So they Google, and it's websites that myself and others had been creating specifically related to my lineage and people connected to us. their light bulb goes off and they say, we can't help you, but you can help us. So I joined this collaborative movement of trying to get Black folks in the United States to come to family search centers across the country. And it landed me being the youngest certified genealogist soon after. I was one of the first genealogists to focus primarily on enslaved ancestors at a time where there were very few people that were talking about direct descent from enslaved people as if it was a practice that could be, as if it was something that could actually be found. And so since then, the genealogy conversation has expanded, resources have been developed. However, there's still a few things that comes up every time you look up African American family history. I'm gonna pause because I've been talking too long and just ask you guys, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of African American family history? Anybody? Slavery. And when you think about slavery, when it comes to learning about your ancestors, what comes to mind? The wall. So I'm gonna tell y'all right now, we're not using that wall word anymore. Hopefully after this talk. But the wall is the first thing you're met with, right? Who do you think invented the phrase, the brick wall? Do you think that was made in-house? It wasn't. It was created by the same people that housed the actual records they claimed did not exist. I'm gonna allow you guys to think about why that was the case, and why that's still part of the case, okay? And so, over time, we've, in the Black genealogy community, have developed a little bit of a framework. So we've decided to move entirely away from the standard way of thinking about family history, the standard way of thinking about genealogy. And just to give you guys this little technical term, patriarchal white standard of genealogy still reigns true to this day, but generally, genealogy in family history is simply the practice of tracing one's ancestry to the past. Historically, it was used to trace inheritance, position a person in power, or create divisive class systems based on a lineage. Black genealogy is a reclamation. It's our ancestor stories being told in order to make sense of our present experiences. We're rediscovering information that was intentionally stolen and erased from us. And so I invite anybody that is listening to this eventually and here with us today to just think about our ancestors as folks that have been intentionally removed from us several times and still are being intentionally removed from us. This tweet went viral a few years ago, and this young woman says, Ancestry DNA should be free for Black people because how are you gonna kidnap us, then charge us $99.99 to tell us where you kidnapped us from? And that pretty much has been the case from the jump. There's still some challenges with Black genealogy, though, even though so much is available today. And part of it is the erasure and the brick walls that you named. The main challenge is, of course, racialized records. So due to segregation, enslavement, and other racist systems, Black people were often recorded in separate books and record collections which may or may not be readily available. Most of the records that our enslaved ancestors are actually recorded on are actually available, at least now. However, are they searchable? Are they free to access? Are they clear? Are they explained? That's a huge issue. There's also a lot of misinformation. So there's records involving Black people that have often been ignored and discarded, and then also told simply don't exist, or you have folks that just create new narratives of Blackness and Black history that doesn't apply to our actual ancestors' lived experiences. And then, of course, the biggest challenge is enslavement. And so because African Americans descend from enslaved people, tracing their family histories can be challenging due to a lack of available resources and help. However, I believe in this doctrine that we have been locked by the lawless, handcuffed by the haters, gagged by the greedy, and if I know anything at all, that a wall is just a wall and nothing more at all, it can't be broken down. I believe that the project Soul Down River here at NSU is part of breaking down that wall. From this moment on, we're gonna leave that wall word in the past, all right? This is from Ashada Shakur's affirmation. As people of color and those on a journey of healing, accountability, self-discovery, and social justice, it is imperative that we do not continue the narratives our oppressors have written about us and our people. In genealogy, we have to operate from the understanding that our ancestors were oppressed in daily life and on record. These records were never created, that we're going to explore today, to amplify our ancestors as people. They were always created to demean them, to commodify them. And so because of that, we're going to jump a little bit forward and talk about you guys, and less about me. See if I can get this presentation up. We're just going to go through this really quick. Who are you? Where you're from? Some terms in genealogy, and then a little bit about what the goals of genealogy are, because we all don't have the same goals. So where are you from? Everybody's history starts with a location. So it starts with place. I'm a strong believer in the power of place. So geography really will impact what one can learn about their ancestors and what's going to show up about their ancestors. What cities, neighborhoods, and towns you've lived in. How did you get there? What were the places made up of? Race and ethnicity is going to impact even closer. How do you define your race and ethnicity today may not align with how your ancestors identified as well. How does your family today define their race is also an important question to ask before you're going into the process of learning about your family history. And then, of course, you have identities further than that, what religions, faiths, and beliefs impact your family history. A little more lingo. I'm just going to fly through here. Of course, most folks have, assuming, come to this space already having explored or thought about their family history in some way, but just a little crash course. Genealogy begins with you. So you'd start with yourself, think about what you already know about your family, list out names, build little family trees. I hope people are talking to their kinfolks, asking them information about their histories, and then starting the search, going to the website like I did, and running into those words that we're going to leave behind. With genealogy, because everything is focused today online to Ancestry.com, Family Search, most of the places that people begin is with those two websites. Creating a family tree is an easy way to just keep everything organized. And then you look for records. The only way to really conduct genealogy, in a sense, is looking at records specifically relating to your family, looking for yourself on a record. Most of us in here have been listed in a phone book or have a birth certificate of sorts. Those records might be available with your name on it, accessible to everybody in this room and all over the world. And so that might be a little concerning, right? With Black genealogy, we really have to think about how this sounds very simple, but it also can be intrusive. It also can be traumatic. It also can be limited, right? Through the process of genealogy, in a Black family in particular, these are some of the things that you might find. Just a little shout out to my great-granddaddy, Ernest Lee Palmore, that this year, I believe, or last year, would have made 100 years since he was born. Next to the photo of him is his birth certificate. And on it, just like any birth certificate, lists critical information about him, where he was born, his name. His name was Ernest Lee Palmore. He was recorded as Elbert Ree Palmore. Why do you think it was recorded as Elbert Ree Palmore? Because the person recording this document was illiterate, essentially, that was providing the information for it. And so the writer heard Elbert Ree instead of Ernest Lee. I could not find this document in the first years of me researching genealogy until I had to go page by page by page to find this in Alabama. This document also gives his parents' names, where they were from, how old they were, where they were born, what they did for work. His mother's name was Matilda McIntyre, but you'll see here that it's written as Tilda. In other records, she'll be written as Tilly. In conversation, she might be called Mo Tilly instead of Matilda, right? These are things that are very unique to a Black family history. Over here, one record that is completely overlooked in genealogy are maps. this location here is still, the building standing today is still, or the building that you're seeing right here is still standing today. My mother was born there, her mother was born there, and so on. Elbert Ree was born right over here in an area that was not paved, and so you don't see that on the map. But this place is still inhabited by my family. I go there every few months. And then you'll come across census records, which are like snapshots into a family's or a household's structure at any given time in 10 years. You'll see here that Grandma Tilly is listed as Tilda McIntyre by her maiden name. She had just lost her husband, I think the year that this was recorded. And you'll see her with her children. There's my granddaddy there, and along with his siblings, but they're all listed with the name McIntyre. Again, when I went into Ancestry.com, I could not find them in this census year because they were called McIntyre. And even though we knew her last name, I had never thought that they would be recorded as McIntyre. But for whatever reason, she was identified as McIntyre because people in the area knew her as McIntyre. So these are just a little example of what you might find. But most people today are really thinking about getting their family history back to the motherland, getting their family history back to the beginning of time, getting their family history back to the kings and queens and so on and so forth. And that's a narrative that's been given to us partially by Roots, and I'm not going to put Roots down at all. But in order to get there, we really have to do the painstaking task of going through the lives of each of our ancestors up to that point of the Middle Passage. And even being able to, even if you were to get to that point, it's a lot more nuanced than the photo that you see to the right, which was taken quite a while after the slave trade, but this is ancestors of a close relative of mine whose family went to Liberia. That said, let's move through what happens when people are all over the country. 1 second. So we're going to talk a little bit about why we're all here today. So it's a little more lingo that I'll breeze through. With Black genealogy, we have to humanize the people that we're descending from and who we're focused on. Slavery, listed here, I refer to as enslavement. We call people enslaved because they were not slaves. They were people who were enslaved. But a couple things that you guys should know about these terms. These terms are going to be referred to in various different ways in various languages, every step of the way of research. We also refer to people today as enslavers, as a willful participant in the enslavement of another human being. All of our ancestors do not descend directly from enslaved people. Here, some people were free people of color before the Civil War. And then there are also freedmen. And so you'll hear me talking about freedmen more so in this next 20 minutes that I have with you guys. But freedmen, especially referred to here, are formerly enslaved people who received their freedom following the Civil War. That is the majority of the ancestors of African Americans. A lot of history and focus, a lot of scholarship around African American history has focused on the transatlantic slave trade. I assume because we all know the exhibit behind us that we all have at least some understanding of that. But today we're going to talk more about a lesser studied topic, the domestic slave trade. Every person in this room has been impacted by the domestic slave trade, whether your family remains here in Virginia or the surrounding area or not. Every ethnic group in this country has some ties to this domestic slave trade. And the domestic slave trade essentially is the inward sale, separation, and spread of Black chattel slavery across the continental United States. So the classic example is that separation of a parent from their child, stories of folks never seeing their family again. The domestic slave trade really sums that experience up. With the domestic slave trade, we have an African American diaspora as well. We have a Virginian diaspora, we have a South Carolina diaspora, and it's felt all throughout our bloodlines. So just a quick rundown. how I got over. We're going to talk about freedom's generation. We're going to talk about that 1870 brick wall a little more and how to get there. We're going to talk about the domestic slave trade, and then how we can navigate the records around the domestic slave trade. So one of the things that comes up with folks when they research their family history is oftentimes they get back to this particular point in history where federally African Americans are recorded for the first time en masse. Of course, free people of color were recorded in earlier years, but in 1870 is often, for the longest time, has been thought of as the earliest record that our ancestors are on. However, we're going to see that that's not the case. But that particular generation that survived the Civil War, that we see on the 1870 census, that generation navigated a lot of change, not just jumping over the line from slavery to freedom, but being recorded in many different ways, deciding what their names were going to be, deciding who they were going to be and where they were going to be. And so the Civil War, of course, breaks down the system of slavery in this country, but one of the things that comes up is you have folks that are basically still, during the Civil War, still in relative enslavement as well. And even following through the years of Reconstruction, you have folks that are stuck in some places, remaining on plantations. You have folks that are moving away, creating entirely new identities. And our ancestors really did something powerful at this time by defining who they wanted to be. And that's going to impact how we find our folks once they put their roots down. What you're seeing here is a freedman's camp. I believe that this one is actually in Louisiana, that was basically taken over, a former plantation taken over by the federal government. The freedmen kicked the federal government off of that plantation and decided that they wanted self-determination and to lead that plantation system the way that they wanted to so that they could benefit their families without federal oversight. As they're putting their roots down, they're also forming new families. They're reconstructing families. This generation, I think, is the most less talked about because people are still trying to get back to their earliest enslaved ancestor or get back to an African. And some of them are part of this generation. But of course, they did things like create schools, churches, and communities. So if you descend from an enslaved person in the United States, there's a few identifiers to just kind of confirm that for you. Because most enslaved people did not have legally recognized surnames, many are simply recorded by their first name, even after slavery, making verifying them in records difficult. There's also this tradition of staying local. Their occupations, their labor, their literacy, and locality all will impact what you can find about your family and also indicate someone who was formerly enslaved. But then there's also movement, depending on where your ancestors were residing during the 1870 census. More often than not, people in the Deep South will have a different birth location than where they reside, which indicates that they were transported in the domestic slave trade. And so if you're like me and your family is from the Gulf Coast, when you get to this point, you'll start to notice that almost all of the birthplaces of our ancestors, unless your ancestors were in Louisiana from the jump, are going to be recorded as parent from Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, South Carolina, North Carolina. When I first started researching, I was noticing this. And I said, okay, there's something here, but no one's talking about this. There's no Google search that can come back that can say why my great-great, however many, is listed as being from South Carolina, but we from Owasso, Alabama was the story that I grew up with. And so that really sparked the interest and desire. As I began to work with hundreds of people with their own family histories and on numerous projects, I started noticing that that was a tradition all across the Deep South. In every time that you see a group of black folks, they're all going to be from the Upper South. Again, no one really was talking about that on the individual level, on that personal level, on family histories. And so again, understanding the place, consider the location of your ancestors, and then go further. Are your ancestors recorded by name in the 1860 or 1850 census? If they are not, they were most likely enslaved. That is a strong answer. Check what's available in those areas. If there's already a project or a supplemental set of records, here in Virginia, we have the I want to say like Ancestral Luck, that there were a few records that pertain specifically to Black folks during this freedom generation that easily identifies where our ancestors were enslaved and who owned them. Slave records can be defined in two different sets. There's pre-emancipation records, which are usually legal documents that recorded the names and other vital information of enslaved individuals as property. There's post-emancipation records, which are anything essentially that follows the Civil War, linking an enslaved person or family with a former enslaver. I'll show you examples of what those are. So with post-emancipation records, which some folks argue are more numerous than pre-emancipation records, they can also be legal and financial. There was the Freedmen's Bureau record, Freedmen's Bank records. There's sharecropping and labor contracts, cohabitation registers, especially here in Virginia, but only surviving for certain counties. Vital records, a birth certificate or a death record can say, slave of so-and-so. There was the United States Colored Troop pension files, which have been an incredible asset to this project in locating descendants of enslaved people. There's also Southern Claims Commission records, where even enslaved people would testify on behalf of their former owners saying, I belong to so-and-so, and these were recorded years after the war. And of course, there's censuses. Then there's narratives. Narratives have a different level of reliability, but of course there were the WPA slave narratives recorded during the Great Depression that interviewed survivors of slavery, and they recorded various levels of personal history, sometimes a little watered down to suit the needs of the children of their enslavers that still lived in the area. And then also, the WPA was interested in a very specific narrative. But there's local histories that might mention an enslaved person. There's oral histories in our own families. I want to say that Black family history, something I left out earlier, relies heavily on oral history. The stories that we remember our family talking about really are our through line into the past. And then, of course, there's personal things. There's missing family ads, which I'll show you a project that is working on indexing and digitizing all of these. There's obituaries that might mention an enslaved person and tell a little bit of a biography about them. And then there's other newspaper profiles of formerly enslaved people as well. Getting personal again, this clip is from 48, maybe earlier than 48, but former Negro slave dies at ripe old age of 99. Christiana Stokes, age 99, 6 months and 18 days. It's a very specific way to record somebody. Died at her home near Owasso on June 17th. She was born as a slave in 1847 and was owned by the Ray family. This is very specific because my grandmother, who was her great niece, was born in 1942 and knew this woman and lived with this woman and remembered her. I know, our family is so close, as if they were first cousins, descendants of this woman. This is not Aunt Christine in this photo, but the reason why I share this with you is because this record opened up in a huge pathway into me even being able to learn about who owned our family. Christiana Stokes' maiden name was McIntyre. Her parents were enslaved. She was enslaved. She was a twin brother of my great-great-great grandfather, Augustus McIntyre, who provided the bricks of the foundation of Tuskegee University. This is that 1870 census that I have been talking about, just in Owasso. Here's Aunt Christine, age 22 or about, listed as a female. She's listed as Black. The little dash mark indicates that. With her husband, Alexander Stokes, my namesake, listed as a farm laborer. Their son, Stephen. And then a really old woman compared to her named Cilla Ray. I had seen this document hundreds of times before I saw that newspaper clipping, which I only got in the last couple years as it became digitized, as it became available. But when I first saw this, I said, who is this Cilla Ray? Why is she from South Carolina? They're all listed as, what you can't see here, is that they're all listed as being from Alabama. But here's this woman from South Carolina. To the right of the page, you would see tick marks that indicate if their parents are of foreign birth. For Black folks, that would mean that their parents were either born in the Caribbean or were African born. And you see that all up and down the census. and then also indications of literacy. Everyone in this household could read and write, including 75-year-old Cilla Ray. In the records that would follow that record that would help me lead to finding out that Cilla Ray's name was actually Priscilla Ray, was the grandmother of Aunt Christine, and therefore my great-great-great so-on grandmother, who survived being trafficked from Chester County, South Carolina to Owasso, Alabama, in the early years of the domestic slave trade. Records that I unfortunately do not directly descend from, I wish I did, that provide a lot of help, that are post-emancipation records, are the Virginia cohabitation records, which are all digitized and readily available here. But they list the names of couples, their children, who enslaved them and where, how old they are, what years that couple started to live together, what years they were recognized as being married, and this document legally married them in the eyes of the Virginia law. There's Virginia experts in here that can correct me on that. So then how do we trace that slave trade from up here to Alabama? How do we actually verify that? How do we provide this link? My family in Alabama in the Deep South had no knowledge of relatives up here. They had no knowledge of where their family came from before Owasso, right? All roads led to Owasso for us. And then when I started to dig into the family history and say, no, Grandma so-and-so was from South Carolina and Virginia, there was this gap that really we felt like we couldn't ever fill. And so I want to walk us through a couple of these. Okay, thank you. Let's just dive into Soul Down River then, shall we? I think that's a better option than going through these nitty-gritty. I'm just going to tell you the story of Soul Down River and exactly how Soul Down River fits into this. I'm so thankful and blessed to have Dr. Newby Alexander, who essentially created the spark that led to this project. Dr. Newby Alexander, as the story has been called to me, approached Troy Vallows, who is the archivist at the Sargent Memorial Collection here in Norfolk. Where was Hall's slave jail in Norfolk? It led to an entire project trying to track down exactly where slave pens in Norfolk were located and who owned them, and also who the people were that were being enslaved in them. It led to, of course, more discoveries. Of course, the discovery of Hall's slave jail and its proximity to the slave trader offices led Troy to asking additional questions about the domestic slave trade activities in Norfolk specifically. Troy retrieved and examined manuscripts of the slave ships that left Norfolk, and as of this last month, they are all completely transcribed. Troy also contacted the Roadstead Montessori High School, which we've had an amazing team of students to help compile these records. And then also, our team has obtained copies of New Orleans' Parish Notary Public Records. Dr. Richmond and Dr. Newby Alexander here at Norfolk became instrumental in the project and continue to. Here's our team. Of course, you know these faces in here. And then also just want to make sure that our friends at Roadstead are mentioned as well. Right now, we are in between phase 2 and 3 of our project, where students here at NSU, we have the incredible Monty White, that has done a considerable amount of work transcribing the notary public records and the manifest of thousands of enslaved people and putting them into a database that will essentially allow folks to easily identify those that were transported. A genealogist was brought on the team to help trace these selected individuals and write more about them, and I was blessed to be that genealogist. Phase 3 will have a second pass through these notary public records, and we'll collect data of as many of the enslaved people, hopefully, that we can, and then we'll publish it. New Orleans is a very important part of this topic because New Orleans was the largest slave auction in the United States. I think that the stat is like every 2 minutes, an enslaved person was sold in New Orleans in particular. But the slave markets of the South varied in size. In New Orleans, a building, the St. Louis Exchange, was described that it became a kind of representation for all of the slave markets. They all did not look like that. Someone's house could be a slave market, but the New Orleans, St. Louis Exchange is where everyone in here has someone that was sold in that auction. But just looking at a little bit of the data, Norfolk shipped more people than anywhere else considered slave exporting ports. And that's what made this project really special to be housed here. What we've continued to do after being able to identify the documents where these enslaved people were sold, we decided to tell their stories also in the process. But I want to go through what telling those stories looks like and some of the painstaking amount of information that goes into this work. So our students here at NSU have gotten intimately familiar with these documents housed in, these are microfilmed versions of documents housed in New Orleans that are very, very neglected and hardly used in historical research. But these documents contain the sales of thousands on thousands of enslaved individuals, and also tons of information of the people that were involved in selling them.
And I will say, I picked this one to put on our website because you can actually read the text. Most of them are not this nice and neat.
Exactly. So we had to scour through loads of indexes to pick and identify people specifically identified with Norfolk slave trade. The indexes also are not very neat, and so we're very thankful for our team doing that. But in order to read these documents, Dr. Richmond actually provided a really cool interactive tool to understand how these documents were typically structured. They would have the index, the seller's information, the price that was being paid for a person, the buyer's information. So in this case, Edmund Soviet Dufresne, who lives in New Orleans Parish, was buying the individual in this sale. And then there's the information that's most important to me, at least, and to any person researching, is going to be the information about the enslaved person. And so this section will list the identity of the enslaved person being sold. In this record, there's a mulattress, meaning someone of mixed race, a visible mixed race, who was a slave named Sophia, aged about 15 years old. Then you'll get more legalese here. Louisiana had what's called the Napoleonic Code. It's the only state that uses the Napoleonic Code, and so it's always marched to a beat of its own drum. But they had to give security that said that this slave, Sophia, wasn't going to be sick, wasn't going to cause any trouble, and also didn't belong to anybody else. They had to guarantee that she now belonged to her new owner. And then you get witnesses and signatures of all the people that looked at her, valued her, and told us how much she was quote unquote worth. So imagine thousands of these documents being transcribed by one individual and how long that would take. We've been blessed that our students have been able to, and our faculty as well, have been able to go through and transcribe so many of these and spend hours and hours going through various degrees of information and records recorded in at least 3 different languages, French, Spanish, and English.
Often all on the same document.
Right, time. I'm gonna go ahead and just say, I get so excited and passionate about this that I wanted to give you guys as dense a talk as possible. And that was a mistake, because there's no way to sum up that much history in one talk. But because we are a very thoughtful and intimate crew, I want to just open up for questions, and maybe we can get some more specifics from you all that you all like to hear. And so I thank you for attending. I thank you for having me. I love when folks reach out with any specific ideas or advice or questions. So please feel free to contact us. Thank you all.